A ray of morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass window of the Church of the Holy Atonement, painting the altar blood red. But on this Sunday morning, the red was more than just the play of light on the white fabric. Pastor James Wilson's body lay prostrate at the foot of the crucifix, and the blood gushing from multiple wounds formed an almost perfect circle around his head, an ominous halo for a man of God. Deacon Eric Benson, who had discovered the body, was still standing in a daze at the entrance to the church when Detective Michael Carter arrived. A tall black man of 38, Carter moved with the confidence of a man who had seen many deaths, but each one still tugged at some string in his soul. "When did you find him?" Carter asked, putting on latex gloves. 6 a.m., the deacon's voice shook. "I came to prepare the church for the morning service. Oh my God, who would do this to Pastor James?" Carter gingerly walked around the body. The pastor was dressed in his church vestments as if preparing for a service, but the multiple stab wounds in his chest and abdomen said one thing: this was not just a death, it was a murder filled with rage and possibly revenge. "Did the pastor have any enemies?" Carter asked the standard question, even though he already knew what the answer would be. "Enemies?" Benson shook his head so vigorously that his glasses moved to the tip of his nose. Pastor Wilson was beloved by the entire congregation. He'd gotten our church off the ground, brought more members here than anyone before him. He was, the epitome of kindness. Carter nodded, never taking his eyes off the body. There was no murder weapon, but the nature of the wounds indicated a knife or similar sharp object. Why had the pastor been killed in a church? Why was he wearing vestments? Everything pointed to some kind of symbolism. This was no random act of violence or robbery. By the time the forensics team arrived, a small crowd had already gathered outside the church. News in such close-knit communities spread faster than a fire in a drought. Carter walked out to them, introduced himself, and asked everyone who had come to the morning service to stay for a statement. "Detective Carter," an older woman with a noble bearing approached him. "I'm Eleanor Robinson, chairwoman of the church council. This is unthinkable. Pastor James was the heart of our congregation. When was the last time you saw him, Mrs. Robinson?" "Last night at Sabbath prayer. He looked, as he always did, calm, peaceful. We were discussing a charity event for disadvantaged children. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Did anyone stay with him after prayers?" the woman wondered. "Deacon Benson always leaves last, locks up the church. Yes, some of the younger parishioners stayed for personal counseling. The pastor often made time for the young people, especially those in need of spiritual guidance." Carter jotted down the information. Over the years, he had learned to hear not only what people were saying, but also what they were holding back. Over the next hour, Carter interviewed about 20 members of the community. The picture that emerged was remarkably wholesome. Pastor James Wilson came across as a charismatic leader who had dedicated his life to serving the church and the community. Most of the accounts were filled with an almost reverential respect, and it made Carter even more wary. In his experience, when everyone speaks exceptionally positively about a person, it could mean either an amazing personality or well-hidden secrets. "May I speak to the young men who stayed for counseling yesterday?" he asked Mrs. Robinson. Of course. It was the baptismal preparation group, Tiffany Jackson, the Brown twins, and Marcus Green. Carter found the twins, two 17-year-old boys, sitting with their parents. Their stories were almost identical. The pastor had talked to them about the meaning of baptism and how important it was to enter adulthood with a pure soul and an open heart. They left with their parents around 9 p.m., leaving the pastor, deacon, and a few others in the church. Tiffany Jackson appeared to be a slender girl of 18 with expressive eyes and a tense posture. She sat next to her mother, a middle-aged woman with a tired but dignified face. "Mrs. Jackson, Tiffany." Carter sat down next to them on the church pew. "I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this, but every detail can help us find the person who committed this crime." "We understand, Detective." Mrs. Jackson held her daughter's hand tightly. "Tiffany is so shocked. We all are. Pastor Wilson was more than a spiritual advisor to us. Since my husband's death 3 years ago, he has been a real pillar for our family." Carter noticed that during these words, Tiffany flinched slightly and looked away. It could have been a display of grief, but the detective's instincts told him otherwise. "Tiffany, were you at the meeting with the pastor yesterday?" The girl nodded without raising her eyes. "What time did you leave?" "V." She hesitated. "About 10:30. We were discussing my baptism. I was to receive it the following Sunday." Her voice trembled, and she fell silent. Carter noticed the whiteness of the girl's knuckles clutching the small purse. "Did you notice anything unusual? Maybe someone came to see the pastor? Or did he look worried?" "No," the answer was too quick. "It was business as usual. Pastor Wilson has always been, attentive to me." Mrs. Jackson gently stroked her daughter's hand. Pastor saw a special spiritual potential in Tiffany. He often said she was chosen for a special ministry. Carter nodded, noting to himself the tension between what mother and daughter were saying and what was read in their body language. "And no one else stayed behind when you left?" "Deacon Benson always stays last," Mrs. Jackson interjected. "He's in charge of the church." "Yes," Tiffany confirmed quietly. The deacon was there. Carter took a few more notes and thanked them for their help, leaving his business card. "If you remember anything else, even the smallest thing, please give me a call. Any detail could be important." As he stepped back, his attention was drawn to a conversation between Deacon Benson and one of the police officers. "Notice anything unusual in the pastor's office?" the officer asked. "No, but I didn't go in there." After evening prayer, the pastor did individual counseling in the main hall of the church. "I was busy in Sunday school, preparing materials for tomorrow's class. I mean today's." Carter approached them. "Deacon Benson, you said you were locking up the church. Were you the last one in last night?" The deacon was visibly nervous. "Yes, as usual. I left about 11 o'clock at night. The pastor stayed. He often worked late in his office. He had his own key." "And all the doors were locked when you came in this morning?" Yes. I guess so. I used my key to get in. But I was so shocked to see the deacon couldn't finish the sentence. "I see." Carter nodded. "Are there any security cameras in the church?" "Only outside, at the main entrance and in the parking lot." The pastor felt that they were inappropriate inside the church. It was a place for open communion with God, without surveillance. The detective noted this information and headed over to the forensics team, who were finishing up their work. Preliminary examination of the crime scene revealed that the murder occurred between 23 p.m. and 2 a.m. The murder weapon was most likely the murder weapon. The murder weapon was most likely a thin-bladed knife, possibly a ritual dagger. There were at least 12 blows, and the nature of the wounds indicated the attacker was highly emotional. After leaving the church, Carter went to the pastor's office, located in a neighboring building of the church complex. It was a small but cozy room with bookshelves filled with religious literature, a large dark wood desk, and several chairs for visitors. On the wall hung pictures of the pastor with various members of the congregation, weddings, baptisms, charity events. Carter studied them, trying to catch the details. In one of the photos, the pastor stood surrounded by young parishioners, including Tiffany Jackson. Carter noticed that the pastor's hand was resting on the girl's shoulder, and there was something in his gaze that made the detective wonder. It wasn't the priest's usual fatherly attention to his parishioner. There was something more personal, almost intimate in that look. As Carter continued his examination, he turned his attention to the pastor's computer. The screen was off, but the system unit was humming quietly. The computer was in sleep mode. The detective gingerly touched the keyboard and the screen came to life, showing an email page. The last message had been sent last night at 10 hours and 30 minutes. The addressee was one RJ. The content of the email was brief. "We need to talk. It is urgent. Meet me at the church at 11. Carter took a picture of the screen and called a technician to remove the computer. It could have been an important clue, perhaps the pastor's last communication before his death. Back at the church, Carter circled the crime scene one more time. The body had already been taken away, but traces of blood remained as bright stains on the marble floor. The detective tried to piece together what had happened. The pastor met someone at the church late at night. That someone brought a knife with them. Had the conversation turned violent? Or was the murder planned in advance? "Detective Carter," His thoughts were interrupted by an officer's voice. "We've reviewed the surveillance footage. There were several visitors between 10 p.m. and midnight. Here's a list and still images." Carter picked up a folder and began looking through the printed images. Deacon Benson leaving the church at 11 o'clock 12 minutes, then a middle-aged man entering at 11:20, his face partially hidden by a hood, and at 11:45 a young female figure, too wrapped up for the warm evening. The camera didn't capture her face, but something in her gait seemed familiar to Carter. As he continued to look around, the detective noticed a small notebook slumped behind one of the benches. He carefully picked it up and opened it. Inside were entries in what appeared to be a woman's handwriting quotations from the Bible, reflections on faith and sin. The last page read, "I can't live with this anymore. Lord, forgive me. He said it was your will, but how can this be your will? I feel defiled. What should I do?" The notebook wasn't signed, but Carter intuitively sensed it belonged to Tiffany Jackson. The detective carefully wrapped the find as evidence and decided to talk to the girl again, but alone without her mother present. Leaving the church, Carter noticed Tiffany standing apart from the other parishioners, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to protect herself from an invisible threat. Their gazes met for a moment, and the detective saw in the girl's eyes a mixture of fear, despair, and something else. Relief? It was an odd expression for someone who had just lost a spiritual advisor. Carter made a mental note to check Pastor Wilson's medical records and delve into his past. Something told the detective that the spiritual leader's impeccable facade could hide dark secrets, and he was determined to uncover them for the sake of justice and for the sake of those who might be suffering in silence, afraid to violate the sacred image of Pastor James Wilson. Dawn painted the sky over Maplewood a pale pink as Detective Michael Carter parked his car outside the Jackson family's modest one-story home. It had been 2 days since Pastor Wilson's murder, and in that time, Carter had managed to gather some information that made him look at the case from a different angle. The door was opened by Martha Jackson, a woman with tired eyes and premature wrinkles cutting across her face. She looked surprised to see the detective so early. "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson. Sorry to bother you, but I need to talk to you and Tiffany." Martha nodded uncertainly and invited him in. Inside, the house was modest but tidy. Family photos and religious pictures hung on the walls. A large portrait of Pastor Wilson blessing the congregation stood out. "Tiffany's still asleep," Martha said quietly, pointing to Carter on the living room couch. "The last few days had been difficult for her, for all of us." "I understand," Carter nodded, pulling out a notebook. "But there are some questions that can't wait. Do you mind if I ask them of you first?" Martha interlocked her fingers nervously. "Of course, Detective. I'll do whatever I can to help find whoever—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "How long have you and your daughter been attending Holy Atonement Church?" "Almost 5 years. We moved here after my husband Robert died. He was in the military, died in the line of duty. I didn't know how to move on. The church was our salvation. Pastor Wilson helped us through our grief." Carter made a note in his notebook. "Was Tiffany close to the pastor?" The question made Martha tense, but she quickly returned a look of mournful resignation to her face. The pastor had shown her special attention. He said he saw a special purity of soul in her. For the past few months, they had met often for spiritual conversations. Tiffany was getting ready to be baptized. Did these meetings always take place in a church? Usually, yes. Sometimes the pastor would invite her to his office for deeper spiritual practices. Martha was quiet. "You know, Detective, my daughter has always been very religious. After her father died, she immersed herself in her faith even more. Pastor Wilson became, almost a saint." At that moment, Tiffany appeared in the doorway, pale, with circles under her eyes. Her lean figure seemed even more fragile in her loose homemade clothes. "Detective Carter?" she said quietly. "Mom said you had some questions." "Good morning, Tiffany. Yes, I'd like to talk to you about Pastor Wilson." The girl slowly lowered herself into the chair opposite. Carter noticed her hands trembling as she fixed a strand of hair. "I found this at the church." The detective pulled out a clear bag containing the notebook he'd found. "Is this yours?" Tiffany flinched as she looked at the notepad. She nodded slowly. "Can you tell me about the last entry?" Carter asked softly. Martha shifted her gaze restlessly from her daughter to the detective. "What are you talking about? What's the tape?" "Mom," Tiffany's voice trembled. "Can I talk to the detective alone?" Martha looked shocked. "But honey, I don't understand." "Please," Tiffany insisted with unexpected firmness. After Martha reluctantly retreated to the kitchen, Tiffany remained silent for a few moments, gathering her thoughts. Then she spoke softly. "You found the body. How? What did he look like?" Carter was surprised by the question, but answered honestly. There was a lot of blood. The killer seemed to have acted in a state of intense anger or desperation. Tiffany nodded, as if that confirmed what she was thinking. "He deserved it," she said so quietly Carter could barely hear her. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that." "Tiffany, what happened between you and Pastor Wilson?" The girl clenched her hands so hard her knuckles turned white. "It started about a year ago. The pastor told me I was chosen for a special form of ministry. At first it was just talking about the Bible, praying. Then he started talking about spiritual intimacy. That the highest form of love for God could be manifested through physical intimacy with his representative on earth." Tiffany spoke in a monotone, like she was retelling someone else's story. "He used the Bible, twisted the meaning of sacred texts. He said that physical intimacy between the chosen souls was a special form of communion. I believed him. I wanted so much to be closer to God, and he seemed so wise, so holy." Carter listened without interrupting. He saw before him a story of manipulation and violence, disguised as a religious service. When had this first happened? In March. In his office, after the evening service, he said a special place was needed for a special form of communion. Tiffany took a deep breath. Then it happened again. Sometimes at church, sometimes at his house, when his wife went to visit her parents. He said it was our secret with God. Carter wrote down the testimony, noting dates and details. "Tiffany, I have to ask a tough question. Have you seen a doctor recently?" The girl froze. Horror flashed in her eyes. "How do you know?" she whispered. "It's my duty to check all possible connections. There is a note in your medical records from last week. A diagnosis." Tiffany covered her face with her hands. "I've always been clean. Before him, he was the only one She couldn't say the words. "When the doctor told me about HIV, I couldn't believe it. I called my pastor that same day. He said he would come to my house when my mom was gone, but instead he sent a text saying we should talk at church during his evening vigil." "And did you go?" Carter asked cautiously. "Yes. I wanted to hear the truth. I wanted to know if he had deliberately infected me." Tiffany raised her eyes to the detective. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. When I got to the church, he wasn't there. I waited for almost an hour and left." Carter nodded, not showing whether he believed her or not. "The cameras recorded a female figure entering the church at 11:45. Was that you?" Tiffany nodded. "I was afraid my mom would see me leaving at night. That's why I wore her hooded cloak." "And who else did you talk to about your diagnosis?" "No one." Tiffany shook her head. "I couldn't tell my mom. She wouldn't have gotten over it. She has so much faith in the pastor." She did. After this confession, Carter talked to Tiffany for about another hour, carefully recording every detail of her relationship with the pastor. He was shocked at the depth of manipulation this young, vulnerable soul had been subjected to. Leaving the Jackson home, Carter wasn't sure Tiffany was telling him the whole truth about the night of the murder, but one thing he knew for sure was that Pastor James Wilson wasn't the righteous man the congregation thought he was. Carter's next stop was the clinic where Dr. Harris worked, the same doctor who had diagnosed Tiffany. "Did my patient consent to disclosure?" the doctor asked, looking at the detective's badge. "It's part of a murder investigation, Dr. Harris. I only want the facts relevant to the case." The doctor nodded and opened the medical records on the computer. "Tiffany Jackson, 18 years old, diagnosed 10 days ago. She came in for a routine checkup, complaining of fatigue and a rash. I suggested a complete workup, including an HIV test, a standard procedure. The result was positive. Retesting confirmed the diagnosis." "Did she say anything about how she might have gotten infected?" Dr. Harris paused. "Doctor-patient confidentiality." "Doctor, we're talking about a murder, possibly related to this diagnosis. She was in shock, the doctor finally answered. Said she'd only had one partner. Some religious man, I gather. She wouldn't give a name. And did you ever treat Pastor James Wilson? The doctor tensed up. Detective, I can't discuss other patients. He's dead, Dr. Harris, and I think his medical condition may have had a direct bearing on his murder. After a long pause, the doctor replied quietly. Pastor Wilson was not a patient of mine, but I know that he did see Dr. Richards at the city hospital. Heard it from his co-workers. That was valuable information. Carter thanked Dr. Harris and went to City Hospital. There, after much negotiation and a formal request, he gained access to the pastor's medical records. What he learned only confirmed his suspicions. Pastor Wilson had never been tested for HIV, at least not officially. There was no mention of any symptoms or illnesses associated with the diagnosis in his chart. That meant he may not have even known about his status, or was carefully hiding it. Back at the station, Carter immersed himself in researching Pastor Wilson's past. 44 years old, model family man, respected member of the community. Before moving to Maplewood 6 years ago, he served another church in a neighboring state. No reason for the transfer was given in the documents. Carter called his counterpart in that state and asked him to gather information about the pastor's previous place of service. That evening, the detective met with Deacon Eric Benson at a small cafe away from the church. The man looked nervous, constantly looking around as if he was afraid they would be seen together. Thank you for seeing me, Deacon Benson, Carter began as the coffee was brought to them. I'm not sure it's right to discuss the pastor behind his back. I mean, you know. Benson adjusted his glasses nervously. Sometimes truth is more important than reputation, especially when life and death are involved. The deacon was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, You know something, don't you? I know that Pastor Wilson manipulated young female parishioners, using religion as a tool of sexual coercion, Carter answered bluntly. And I know that at least one of them contracted HIV from him. Benson turned pale. His hands shook so hard he spilled his coffee. Oh my God, he whispered. So it's true then? Did you know? Ia suspected. I'd noticed strange behavior with some of the younger members of the congregation. Special meetings, closed doors, but I didn't want to believe it. He was so convincing, so charismatic. People believed every word he said. What about his past? Why had he left the previous church? The deacon looked away. There were rumors of inappropriate behavior with a young parishioner. Nothing was ever proven. The church leadership decided it would be best if he continued his ministry elsewhere. A parishioner? Carter emphasized the masculine gender. Yes, young man, I believe his name was Richard Johnson, but like I said, it was hushed up. Carter recalled the email sent from the pastor's computer. RJ? Richard Johnson? This man is in Maplewood now? Yeah, he moved here about a year ago. I think he was following the pastor. They, stayed close. What do you mean, close? Benson squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. I don't want to spread rumors. Deacon, this is a murder investigation. Any information could be important. They met privately often. Richard came to his office, sometimes stayed late. I once saw them, hugging, not the usual pastor-parishioner hug. Carter was writing down testimony, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And where can I find this Richard Johnson? He works at a music store on Main Street. Plays the organ during some of the services he used to play. With this new information, Carter went to the music store. Richard Johnson appeared to be an attractive man in his early 30s, with brooding eyes and nervous movements. When Carter introduced himself, Richard visibly tensed. I know why you're here, he said as he led the detective into the back room of the store. Because of James, right? You knew Pastor Wilson? Richard grinned bitterly. Familiar? We were all for each other. At least that's what I thought. Carter watched the man's reactions carefully. Did you meet him the night he was killed? Yeah. He made an appointment at the church. Said it was urgent that we talk. About what? Richard ran his hand over his face. 3 weeks ago, I found out I was HIV positive. James was the only person I'd been close to in recent years. I called him, told him about the diagnosis. He was, shocked. Said he'd get tested. But then he started avoiding me. He wouldn't return my calls, canceled appointments. I was desperate. Finally that night he agreed to talk. And what happened during that meeting? He denied everything, said I must have gotten it from someone else, accused me of being unfaithful, of trying to tarnish his reputation. Richard clenched his fists. And then, he confessed to sleeping with others, young parishioners, girls he was preparing for baptism, said it was part of his special ministry. Carter could see Richard shaking at the memory. I was furious. We were yelling at each other. I pushed him, but I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't kill him. I left around 11:30. He was alive when I left. Cameras caught a man leaving the church at 11:32. Was that you? Yeah. I was out of it, trying to hide my face. Did you have an alibi for the time after that? Richard shook his head. I walked the streets, tried to calm down, then I went home, alone. Carter wrote down the statement and thanked Richard for his cooperation, leaving his business card in case he remembered anything else. Back at the station, the detective laid out all the available evidence and statements in front of him. A picture was beginning to emerge, but there were still gaps. He knew that Pastor Wilson was a manipulative man who used his position for sexual gratification. He knew that at least 2 victims, Richard Johnson and Tiffany Jackson, had contracted HIV from him. He knew that on the night of the murders, both of them had come to the church to talk to the pastor. But which of them had delivered the fatal blows? Or was it a third person? A call from a colleague in a neighboring state interrupted Carter's musings. I found something interesting about your pastor, said the voice on the phone. He left his former church after a series of complaints from parents of young parishioners. Officially, because of doctrinal disagreements. Unofficially, he was accused of inappropriate behavior with teenagers. The case was hushed up because the church leadership didn't want a scandal. What about Richard Johnson? He was at the center of the scandal. Young organist, very religious guy from a conservative family. Pastor Wilson took him under his wing. A year later, Richard's parents sounded the alarm when they noticed changes in their son's behavior and his unusual affection for the pastor. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Carter thanked his colleague and hung up. He looked again at the crime scene photos, the surveillance footage, the witness statements. 3 people had attended the church the night of the murder: Deacon Benson, Richard Johnson, and Tiffany Jackson. Benson left first, followed by Johnson. Tiffany was the last to arrive and, according to her testimony, did not catch the pastor alive. But could this testimony be believed? Carter decided to talk to Martha Jackson again. He found her at the church, where she was helping to prepare the hall for the pastor's farewell. Mrs. Jackson, can I ask you a few questions? Martha looked exhausted but nodded. Tiffany told me about her relationship with Pastor Wilson, Carter began, watching the woman's reaction. Martha's face froze. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Mrs. Jackson. Your daughter contracted HIV from a man you thought was a saint, a man who manipulated her, taking advantage of her faith and vulnerability. Martha pressed her lips together so hard they turned white. Tiffany had always been impressionable. She has a fertile imagination. It's not imagination, Mrs. Jackson. We have medical records and statements from the other victims. Victims? Martha shook her head. Pastor Wilson was a man of God. He was a man, Mrs. Jackson, a man with weaknesses and sins, a man who betrayed the trust of those who believed in him. Martha suddenly sank back into the church pew, her shoulders trembling. I didn't want to believe, she whispered. When Tiffany changed, became withdrawn, when I found those strange entries in her diary, I asked the pastor and he said it was just a spiritual trial, that she was going through a milestone in her religious journey. When did you find out about Tiffany's diagnosis? Martha raised tearful eyes to Carter. The day the pastor was killed. I found the test results in her room. I called him, demanded an explanation. He said it was lies, slander, that Tiffany must have been leading a double life. Martha clenched her fists. I believed him more than I believed my own daughter. And what did you do then, Mrs. Jackson? I went to church. I wanted to hear the truth from him myself. I wanted to look him in the eye when he denied ruining my daughter's life. Carter listened intently without interrupting. And what happened when you met him? Martha was silent for a long time, then spoke in a quiet but unexpectedly firm voice. He confessed. Not right away, but when I showed him the test results, he laughed. Said Tiffany wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last. that it was his way of bringing the chosen ones closer to God. Carter saw Martha's expression change at that memory, the sorrow giving way to muffled rage. "I had a knife in my bag," she continued after a long pause. "I've always carried it for protection ever since I was alone with my daughter. I don't remember how it ended up in my hand. I don't remember throwing the first punch. I only remember his surprised face and my own scream." Martha Jackson's confession echoed through the silence of the church like a deafening gunshot. Detective Michael Carter stared silently at the woman who had just confessed to the murder of Pastor James Wilson. There was no remorse in her eyes, just endless fatigue and a strange relief, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "I must detain you, Mrs. Jackson," Carter said at last. "Do you understand that?" Martha nodded, her face remaining calm. "I understand, Detective, and I'm prepared to answer for my actions." She looked up at him. "But first I need to know what's going to happen to Tiffany." "She's going to need support," Carter replied softly, "and medical attention. But I'll make sure her story is told properly. She's a victim, not a criminal." Martha rose slowly from the bench. "Before we go, I want to show you something." She pulled a small leather-bound book out of her bag and held it out to the detective. "It's Tiffany's personal journal. I found it after that night. I couldn't bring myself to read it all the way through, but I think you should see it." Carter gently accepted the diary, realizing the value of this evidence. "I took care of her body, but I forgot to take care of her soul," Martha said quietly. "I was so consumed with my own grief after my husband's death that I didn't notice how my daughter was being destroyed from the inside out." On the way to the police station, Martha Jackson sat in the back seat of the police car, straight and collected, as if she were on her way to an important business meeting rather than a murder arraignment. Carter glanced at her occasionally through the rearview mirror, trying to understand this woman who was protecting her daughter the way many predatory animals protect their cubs, fiercely and without hesitation. At the station, Martha was handed over to the police officers for formal detention and deposition, and Carter retired to his office with Tiffany's diary. He had a strange feeling. The case had been solved. The murderer had confessed. But instead of satisfaction, he was filled with a heavy sense of incompleteness, as if there were something else, something important, hidden behind the obvious facts. Tiffany's diary proved to be a remarkably candid document of the spiritual and emotional fall of a young soul. The first entries, dated some 18 months earlier, were full of religious fervor and sincere faith. Tiffany wrote of her prayers, her desire to grow closer to God, and her deep gratitude to Pastor Wilson for his wise guidance. "Pastor James said today that he sees a special light in me," she wrote in an early entry. "Said God has chosen me for a special mission, for a special form of ministry. I am so excited and scared at the same time. What if I don't live up to expectations?" Gradually the notes changed. There were hints of special lessons and secret knowledge that the pastor shared only with a select few. The pastor says that physical intimacy between spiritual director and disciple is an ancient tradition dating back to the apostles themselves, read an entry dated about a year earlier. He showed me texts that talk about how knowing in the biblical sense means deep spiritual and physical union. It's strange and a little scary, but can I doubt a man who is so close to God? Carter read these writings with a growing sense of anger. He saw Tiffany's confidence gradually being replaced by doubt, fear, and finally deep despair. "I no longer feel God when the pastor touches me," she wrote a few months ago. "I feel only shame and dirt. But he says it's a test of my faith, that doubts are sent by the devil, that if I turn away now, I will betray not only him but God himself." The most recent entries were full of confusion and fear. Tiffany described her physical symptoms, a visit to the doctor, a terrifying diagnosis. HIV 3 letters that redefined my life. How could God allow this to happen? How could a man who speaks for God do this to me? I called my pastor. He said it was impossible, that I must have been with someone else. He accused me of lying to him. I have nowhere to go, no one to tell. My mom will never believe her adored pastor could do such a thing. The last entry was dated the day of the murder. "Pastor agreed to meet me at church tonight. I don't know what I will say to him. I don't know what I will do. I pray for strength and clarity, but God is silent. Maybe he has turned his back on me." Maybe I deserve this punishment for my blindness and stupidity. After reading the diary, Carter leaned back in his chair, trying to digest what he had read. The story that unfolded in those pages was a story not only of sexual abuse and manipulation, but of the destruction of faith, the destruction of a young girl's very soul. Now he had to talk to Tiffany herself. He found her in the station's waiting room, pale, like a fragile ghost of her former self. A social worker, called in for support, sat beside her. "Tiffany," Carter began softly, sitting down across from her, "your mother confessed to Pastor Wilson's murder." The girl raised her eyes to him with a look of horror in them. "No, that's impossible. Mom couldn't have. She found your test results. She went to talk to the pastor. He, showed no remorse." Tiffany put her hands over her face. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so stupid, so gullible—" "No," Carter interrupted her firmly. "It wasn't your fault. You were victimized by a man who used his power and authority to manipulate you. It was his fault, not yours." Tiffany shook her head. "You don't understand. Mom killed a man because of me. Now I'm going to lose her too." Carter took the girl's hand, feeling her trembling. "Your mother protected you the only way she saw fit at the time. That doesn't excuse her actions, but it helps you understand them." "What happens now?" Tiffany asked quietly. "She'll be charged with murder. But given the circumstances—" Carter paused. "There'll be an investigation. The court will decide what punishment she'll receive. Given her motive and emotional state, there's a chance of a reduced sentence." "What about me? Do you have any relatives who can take care of you?" "My aunt is in Atlanta," the girl answered uncertainly. "We're not very close, but we'll get in touch with her. In the meantime, you need medical and psychological help." Carter handed her a business card. "It's the contacts for a support center for people with HIV. They can help with treatment and counseling." Tiffany took the card with a lifeless motion. "You know, the scary thing is, I'm not sure I'll ever believe again, not just in people, but in God. The pastor stole not only my health, but my faith." Carter was deeply moved by these words. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he realized that for people like Tiffany, faith was a pillar, a compass in life, and to lose that compass was perhaps the hardest loss of all. Faith is personal, Tiffany. No one can take it away from you completely, even if it feels like it right now. Perhaps in time you will find your own way to God, without intermediaries. Leaving the girl with the social worker, Carter went in search of Deacon Benson. Another piece of the puzzle kept him busy. Did Pastor Wilson know about his HIV status? Had he knowingly endangered his victims? He found the deacon in the deserted church, where he was gathering the pastor's belongings to give to his widow. "Deacon Benson," Carter began without preamble. "What do you know of Pastor Wilson's health?" Benson shuddered, almost dropping the stack of papers. "Health? He's never complained. I'm talking specifically about his HIV status. Did you know he was infected?" Benson turned pale, his hands shook. "Yeah, suspected, but he never said so explicitly." "Why did you suspect?" The deacon sank into the pew, suddenly looking much older than his years. "About 6 months ago, I happened to see some drugs in his office. Drugs that I know are used for antiretroviral therapy. He, asked him about it. He said it was for an out-of-town acquaintance who was too shy to buy it himself." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to believe," Benson answered quietly. "I wanted to believe that a man I respected couldn't be so irresponsible." He raised his eyes to the detective. "But then I started to notice changes in his behavior. He became more irritable, more secretive. And the young men he was doing special counseling with. I couldn't help but think about it. Why didn't you tell the authorities? Why didn't you sound the alarm?" "Detective," the deacon grinned bitterly. "You don't understand how the church works. Reputation is everything. A scandal could have destroyed not only the pastor, but our entire congregation. I convinced myself that I could control the situation, limit his access to younger parishioners." He shook his head. "I was a coward." "Did his wife know of his proclivities?" "Melanie?" Benson hesitated a moment. "She'd always been a very devoted wife, supported him publicly, created the image of the perfect pastoral family. But for the past year, they'd been practically separated. She was away at her parents' house a lot, sometimes for weeks at a time. Do you think she might have known about his relationship with the congregation? I don't know, the deacon answered honestly. Melanie has a knack for turning a blind eye to things that don't fit her idea of an ideal life. But to completely overlook? That's hard to imagine. Carter made a few more notations in his notebook. Martha Jackson confessed to killing the pastor, he said, watching the deacon's reaction. Benson looked shocked. Martha? But she was such a devoted parishioner. She found out that the pastor had infected her daughter with HIV, that he had manipulated the girl, using her faith to sexually coerce her. The deacon lowered his head. God, poor Tiffany. I've noticed the way he looks at her, but I didn't think he'd go this far. He looked up at Carter. I had to stop him. I should have done something. Right now, you can help by telling the whole truth. It won't bring Tiffany and the other victims back to health, but it might help them get justice and support. Over the next few days, Carter immersed himself in the paperwork for the Martha Jackson case. Deacon Benson's testimony, Tiffany's diary, and medical records all indicated that Pastor Wilson was indeed a predator who had used his position to manipulate and abuse. A meeting with Richard Johnson, the pastor's former lover, confirmed that Wilson was likely aware of his HIV status. According to Richard, the pastor refused to be tested despite having symptoms for more than a year. He preferred to trust God in matters of health. That was his excuse for everything, Richard bitterly remarked. God is leading me. It's part of the divine plan. He used religion as a shield behind which he hid his true desires and fears. When all the case files were assembled, Carter visited Martha Jackson in the detention center. She seemed calm, almost peaceful. How's Tiffany? Was the first thing she asked. She moved in with her aunt in Atlanta, started treatment. It's a long road, but with modern drugs, HIV is a chronic disease that you can live a full life with. Martha nodded. I wrote her a letter. I don't know if she'll read it. I've let her down so much. You were protecting her, Carter said softly, though not in the way the law approves. I don't regret what I did, Detective, Martha said firmly. I only regret that I couldn't protect her sooner, that I blindly trusted a man just because he wore a cross and spoke for God. Your attorney has been given the entire case file, including Tiffany's diary and the testimony of the pastor's other victims. Given the circumstances, there are grounds for a reduced charge. It doesn't matter anymore. Martha shook her head. Whatever the verdict, I'll accept it. The only thing I ask is that you make sure the truth about Pastor Wilson gets out, so that other parents don't make my mistake. Carter promised to do his best. The epilogue came 6 months after the murder of Pastor James Wilson. Martha Jackson was found guilty of murder with extenuating circumstances and sentenced to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 7 years. Holy Redemption Church was unable to recover from the scandal. Many parishioners left, unable to reconcile themselves to the fact that the man they had trusted with their souls had turned out to be a liar and a rapist. Some, however, stayed, trying to rebuild the congregation under the leadership of a new pastor, a young woman with a sincere desire to heal the wounds inflicted by her predecessor. Deacon Eric Benson left the church and founded a support center for victims of abuse, especially those who had been hurt by spiritual leaders. His experience and repentance became the basis for a program to help people recognize manipulation and protect themselves. Richard Johnson continued his treatment and became an HIV awareness activist. His story of how a religious leader used his position to exploit vulnerable people helped many find the strength to speak out about their experiences. Tiffany Jackson has perhaps traveled the most difficult path. Her physical health gradually stabilized through therapy, but her mental wounds were slower to heal. She enrolled in college in Atlanta, choosing psychology as her major, perhaps trying to understand how a man she trusted so much could so cruelly betray that trust. Detective Michael Carter occasionally received letters from her. In the last one, she wrote, I no longer believe in religion the way I used to, but I am beginning to believe in people, in their ability to heal, to change, to find light even after the deepest darkness. Maybe that's what real faith is. Carter has often thought about this case, about how blind faith can lead to tragedy, and about how true faith, in oneself, in goodness, in justice, can help one recover from even the worst betrayal. The Church of the Holy Atonement stood where it was, but something subtly changed. The stained glass windows still refracted the sunlight the same way, but now it fell on new faces, new stories, new hopes. Pastor James Wilson's story was a warning of the dangers of unconditional trust, of questioning even those who seem blameless. And in her cell at the Women's State Prison, Martha Jackson prayed every night, not to the abstract God Pastor Wilson preached, but to her own understanding of ultimate justice. She prayed for forgiveness, not for the murder of the man who had ruined her daughter's life, but for the blindness that had allowed it to happen. "Forgive me, Lord, for not seeing the truth," she whispered into the darkness of her cell. "And give me the strength to help others see it before it's too late." And somewhere far away, in a college dorm room in Atlanta, Tiffany Jackson was opening a new blank page of her journal, not to write about God or faith, but to record her own thoughts, her own path to healing. A path that began not with belief in the invisible, but with acceptance of the visible self, her power, her right to live after betrayal.